Hello, I'm Stephan Schwartz, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Schwartz Report podcast. Today, I want to talk about something that very insidious that is going on in all over the world, but I'm particularly focused on the United States because it is directly eating away at our democracy and our ability to learn, and let alone do impeccable science or make the right education decisions. I am really struck by this because almost every day, as many of you know, I do the daily Schwartz Report online. I get emails or texts from people who say the most preposterous things, and I wonder where in the world could they have heard that, or what convinced them about that. And it's the weaponization of lies. It's beginning to be called in academia the misinformation effect. The way false or misleading information distorts a person's understanding of a topic, even when they know some of the basics of it. It just warps the way they think. And it is becoming a really serious issue. And I see this every day, and I'm not quite sure how to respond. I mean, I write these people back and say, that's just not factually accurate. But it's the emotions that are engaged, not the intellect. And as you know, on Schwartz Report, both the web publication and on this podcast, what I care about is promoting well-being and talking about issues on the basis of facts, not political partisanship, not philosophies, objectively verifiable facts. So let's start actually at the beginning, because when the founders created the First Amendment in 1791, they understood the power of misinformation. They saw it as someone spreading a false rumor in a pub, or a printer distributing flyers that were filled with misinformation, or a charismatic speaker spewing lies to a crowd in a square. They worded the amendment itself in a way that reveals their thinking. And you can look at it here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's what the founders were thinking about when they put this together. The idea of internet and social media read by millions of people each day, who could carry around a device about the size of a snuff box, was nowhere in their minds. The technology of misinformation, which has taken over the country and the culture in ways that just have so many effects, and I'm going to try to cover a few of them that just don't get any conversation. They just didn't anticipate citizens, adults, averaging 2.5 hours a day reading social media, while the young spend an average of 4.8 hours a day. Girls spending nearly an hour more than boys, 5.3 versus 4.4. Much of that time absorbing misinformation instead of facts. Information, but disinformation that shapes their thinking and their trust in the government. Do we have any actual data on what effect this is causing? Because you don't hear people talking about it very much. You talk a lot about social media, But the fact that it is literally altering the culture doesn't get a lot of discussion. So I went looking for research that would clarify these issues and give me some objectively verifiable facts. I went, for instance, to the Center for Countering Digital Hate. That's a nonprofit that fights misinformation. And they surveyed this issue in depth and found that 49%, nearly half of Americans, agree with at least 4 statements which align with common conspiracy theories, the kind of stuff that I get in my email inbox or in my smartphone texts. Things about anti-Semitism, white supremacy, vaccines, climate change. Belief in conspiracy theories starts at a preposterously young age. It's amazing, really. I mean, if you look at this slide about the average screen time by subgroup, and you see that 13-year-olds are beginning to use hours of their day. When I was young, you went outside, you played outside, you came home, somebody said to you, "What did you do?" You said, "I went out." "What did you do?" And you said, "Nothing." Now you see kids just sitting around together looking at their cell phones. And the Center for Hate in media, social media, discovered that kids who are younger than teenagers and teenagers who use social media heavily, 69% showed that 60% of 13 to 17-year-old Americans agreed with 4 or more harmful conspiracy statements, compared to 49% of adults. So the older you get a little smarter, but still 60% of 13 to 17-year-olds believe 4 harmful conspiracy statements, and 49% of their parents do the same. For teens who spend 4 or more hours a day on any single social media platform, the figure went as high as 69%. This is a form of indoctrination through the manipulation of misinformation. That's nowhere in what the founders thought when they created the First Amendment. I mean, how could they? Ben Franklin had just discovered electricity. And yet, this is altering the whole nature of our culture. And it is having a number of effects that nobody talks about or thinks about. For instance, teens who spend more than 5 hours a day on social media were 60% more likely to express suicidal thoughts or thoughts of harming themselves, 2.8 times more likely to hold a negative view of their own bodies, and 30% more likely to report a lot of sadness and sense of aloneness. You know, you go up on social media and you look at pretty teenagers who are posting stuff and you think, you know, I don't look like that. I'm fat, or I'm thin, or my face isn't as handsome or as pretty. And that has a strong effect on them from a social point of view. So think about that. It's a real issue. Adolescent mental health problems directly correlate with screen time usage. So, and this, by the way, is not specific to all social media. You can even distinguish which social media. Mental health problems, for instance, are particularly associated with YouTube and TikTok. Body image problems show significant effects associated with time spent on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and WhatsApp, but not on other platforms. So I want to be clear here. The weaponization of lies, this is not an abstraction. We're not in a philosophical discussion here. We are looking at actual physical and psychological effects that are impacting all of us, but are particularly impacting the young to a point where it's not only potentially damaging, it can be lethal. And I just want to give one example of this. There are many, but I want to give one because I'm so struck by what it has produced. And just amongst friends that I know, this became a huge issue. And this is the question of vaccination. Now, for most of the last 50 years, vaccination has been a standard procedure. Look at this chart. It shows you this is what parents are told they have to do, the vaccinations they have to get for their kids to go to school. Look at the polio vaccine, for instance. When I was a boy, one of my closest friends, when he was about 9 years old, came down with polio and was put in an iron lung. You don't see these anymore. You don't hear people talk about them. I've never forgotten it. I went in to see it. His name was Murr Ottinger. And I went in to see Murr, and he was in this kind of big metal tube. And the only thing that stuck out was his face. And the only way he could, because he couldn't see behind or to the side, he had a mirror that was up on an angle so that he could see people who were speaking to him. And I went to visit him several times. And sometimes he couldn't even be visited because he just wasn't up for it. And eventually he died. And that experience has never left me. Looking at a 9-year-old boy in a big light green tank with a mirror in front of his face so that he could see people. And you could only have a conversation. He couldn't even reach out with his hands to take something because his entire body from the neck down was in that tank. I have never, ever forgotten that. And yet, who thinks about polio today? Why? Because of vaccination. As the World Health Organization explained, Jonas Salk tested his experimental killed virus vaccine on himself and his family in 1953, and a year later on 1.6 million children in Canada, Finland, and the US. And the results were announced on 12 April 1955, and Salk's inactivated polio vaccine, what is called an IPV, was licensed on the same day. And by 1957, annual cases had dropped from 58,000 kids. You'd go to the pool, and a few days later, you'd find out that some kid had come down with polio from 58,000 to 5,600. And by 1961, 161 cases. Most Americans under the age of 50 have never seen or even thought about polio. And yet, I can tell you from my own childhood, it was a disease which so terrified the nation and the world that pools closed down, you wouldn't get together in groups, all sorts of normal childhood things. You couldn't go to Coney Island, for instance, must have to attend school. In order to do that, they had to get a vaccination. You may remember getting yours. It was universal. And in stark contrast, consider what's happening and what has happened with us with COVID-19, a disease that, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has killed over 1 million Americans. 1 million Americans. 1,148,691 as of 14 October 2023, the last time I looked. And there's something, when you look at the data, when you dig into this terrible number, what you find is an enormous disparity between Republicans and Democrats. Now look at this chart. Look at the mortality gap. Why is that happening? Why is it that in red states, the death rate from COVID-19 is so much greater than it is in the counties that are Democratic? It's because the people in those red counties, those red states, were given misinformation. Now, I know all the anti-vaxxers, yes, not all vaccines were as good or as effective as others. There were some problems, no question about it. There always are in these kind of things. But the death rate, death, not sickness, death rate between those who got vaccinated and those who did not are preposterous. So why this disparity? Well, as I say, it's not science. It's weaponized misinformation for political purposes. And it directly correlates with the level of education a person has. You don't think about that either, but the data are clear. The more education an individual has, the more progressive an individual's worldview is likely to be. Or translated into what I think is really relevant, the more you learn to think and assess facts, the more likely you are to support programs that foster well-being, the more likely it is that you will be a Democrat. No one talks about that, and yet the facts are there. In terms of COVID conservatism, this is translated into an anti-science, anti-vaxxer, anti-mask movement that is the core of what now amounts over 1 million people to what I think of as an American death cult. I have friends who have died because they wouldn't get vaccinated. I hear people that I know and see socially talk about family members who died because they wouldn't get vaccinated. I know people who have children who got caught up in this anti-vaxxer thing and didn't get vaccinated and died. NPR tracked political affiliation with whether a person was vaccinated or not. In December of 2021, they published their results, and it was a dramatic difference between conservatives and Republicans. The ACA Synapse Net, from its own research, reported the same thing that the NPR found and noted, and I quote, "New cases are now running 2.71 times higher per capita in the reddest tenth of the country than the bluest tenth of the country." It's a confluence of social and neuroscience research that has presented us with findings that describe the pandemic response amongst Republicans, driven more by fear and misinformation than rational thought about scientific facts. That's what this weaponization of misinformation is doing to us as a people. And I believe that history will come to see this tragedy created by the politicization of misinformation made possible by social media as one of the most historic events in the country's history. And it is taking hold amongst teenagers in all kinds of negative ways, as I've pointed out. Suicidal thoughts, a sense of inadequacy, a sense of unattractiveness. Is this really how we're going to build the culture of the future? Is this really what we want to have happen? I just can't think that that's what we want. And so the question really becomes, what do we do about this? And the answer, I think, is that we have to look at free speech. Yes, I'm completely for free speech, but facts. You must be able to prove facts about things like this. Spreading misinformation, spreading vile rumors, politicized attempts to alter social behavior. That is not a future that supports democracy. This has made me think about this a great deal. And I urge you to think about it, because we need to come up with a way to combat misinformation, or it's going to take over our culture. It's going to end our democracy. And we're going to become something we can hardly recognize. Thank you.